So in the first reading, we hear how there are all these very big manifestations of things. And Elijah is looking and saying, is the Lord there? And he's not in any of them. He's only in that still, small whisper. And that's the way that the Lord works. That's where the deepest power of what we're looking for is actually in that hidden area. And we can see that in the way that we're called to love responsibly. This is actually something that I'm studying right now in my classes. So I'm back in school, and we're studying the theology of the body. So we're reading the work by Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, who's also known as St. John Paul II, called Love and Responsibility. And one of the things that he points out in there is sort of what happened maybe about half a century ago in the midst of what we call the sexual revolution of the 1960s, 70s, and sort of looking at what happened in such a quick time that broke families apart. We saw this huge rise of divorce, and not even that, but this huge rise of just not even a need to be married, not even a need, even our younger people are saying, I don't really need it. Marriage is at an all-time low. And we can also look back and say, are we a happier people? Have we really experienced the love that satisfies in the midst of our relationships? And if we really look into our hearts, we'll say, it seems like as a people, we've really kind of lost this depth. And maybe we found other things, but by reaching for those other things, it's actually hurt us in other areas. And so St. John Paul II would say that one of the tragedies that happened is in taking something that very much is rooted in nature, the sexual act, which has an inbuilt meaning to it. It's something that you don't just sort of say, well, culture just sort of makes this. It's written into our very DNA that particular act, which is a gift from God, has two purposes, two ends. One of them is to bring a couple together to a deeper union in body, mind, and soul, to really image the Trinity in this love, this self-gift to one another, to not use one another, because the opposite of love is use. And also the ordering towards the gift of children. And in fact, in nature, we see that both of them are important, but the moment that you sort of break them apart and say, we're going to follow this, but we're going to reject this, things start to happen. Things start to break down. And we could look both on one side in the area of what we call artificial contraception, in which we say, I refuse to even consider the gift of life in the midst of that action. So we focus on the unitive side, but we reject the procreative side, this openness towards life. Or we focus on the other side, saying, I reject the unitive side, and I just have the desire to have a child, and that's what we call in vitro fertilization. So there's sort of two different sides of this. Now, what happened that St. John Paul II would say is, the moment we started tampering with this, it's kind of like genetic things when you deal with like genetic manipulation or different things like that. There's even movies about this where you're dealing with something and, and sort of this sense of like, just because I can do it, because I have the power to do it, doesn't mean that I should tamper with it. If you think of Jurassic Park, you have an amazing science to bring back dinosaurs. But if you remember that one character, he says, just because you should do it, or just because you can do it, don't necessarily bring dinosaurs back, because there's going to be a repercussion when you mess with Mother Nature. Something breaks down. Or when we meddle with different kind of genetic things, or even, different kinds of things that can just kind of get unleashed. Sometimes people even say, well, maybe like the SARS or coronavirus or different things like that. I don't know, but if you just sort of deal with things, they might sort of take on a whole nother kind of life of their own. So in nature, we have to respect the gift that's been given to us. To be very careful when we sort of go right in and break something apart. Because St. John Paul II would say, in the sexual revolution, when we started to say, we have the ability of not needing to love responsibly, because before, there was always this need that if you're going to engage in that beautiful gift of the sexual act, you have to be open to the possibility of life. And in order to be able to do that responsibly, you have to be able to be in a covenant of love that is an until death do us part, or else you're basically saying, I can go into this, and if there is the possibility of children, then I'm not able to really take care of them in a responsible way. And unfortunately, our culture has said, well, then that's why we need contraception, to cut off that possibility, and if that doesn't work, that's where we need abortion to be a final solution. So the moment that in the 60s, we started to be able to say, we have the ability of experiencing a sort of freedom to enter into this world of pleasure, which pleasure is a gift from God, but this kind of way of saying, without responsibility to go anywhere that we want, to experience any sort of things. And yes, that might lead us to maybe certain kinds of pleasure that we had never experienced before, but in doing that, there's a hurt in another side. Just like someone who wants to experience the euphoria of certain kinds of drugs, you might experience a pleasure that you've never ever experienced before by having LSD. But just by unleashing that and opening that, something happens to your brain. Your brain becomes rewired. And even though you, in a sense, have this ability of something that you've never experienced before, you're, in a sense, killing another part of you. That is where you have a deeper fulfillment and happiness. And that's actually what happened, that the very consciousness and desire itself got restructured in our brain, so that it's harder to defer that sexual gratification. We don't know how to, in a sense, wait to be able to love responsibly in a way that doesn't use the other person. With a lot of the way that our brain has been restructured, through what we see on TV, through the different things that we experience, little by little, our ability to be able to see another person as a loving subject starts to disappear. And we end up using the person as an object in order for us to gain a maximal ability of pleasure, because we've already experienced that whole world saying, I can have this without having to worry about any consequences. And we say, well, if the other person is also seeking the very same thing, and it's really about helping each other find the maximal pleasure in an entertainment kind of way, without any sort of responsibilities, any sort of commitment, then in a sense you make each other objects. You actually objectify the person and you objectify yourself. And in doing that, yes, you might experience a euphoria in some way, but that deeper part of who we are as a human person, that we're made to be a gift of one another to another person, to love responsibly, to be able to find the deepest joy that also brings that deepest pleasure when it's a sacrificial love. That's saying, I love you, not because of what you can do for me, but because I love you as a person. And we've sort of lost that ability. We've become very shallow. If you think about all the sort of technology and the ability and even what we're able to do on TV and the sort of numbing down of even things that are on just regular TV that we would look at maybe several generations before and be like, what is this? But now we sort of look at that and say, well, that's just normal. And it trains us and trains our younger people to, in a sense, say, this is the way that I'm supposed to relate to others. If I go on a date, well, then maybe it's the first time or second time, then I'm going to be in bed with that person. And we just don't know how to, because there's a restructuring in our very consciousness of how to act, that we've lost this ability. And in doing that, we actually become sadder because we're not experiencing freedom to be who we were made to be. We become a slave to our passion, to our desire. And we become unhappier and unhappier as our culture goes. So going to this scripture passage. So this is all from St. John Paul II. Someone who really understood the human person. He was a philosopher. He spent so much time with couples, talking to them, asking them about this experience of their desire to love and be loved. And started to realize kind of what happened in our culture that led us to what we thought was going to lead to love. But in a sense, we all feel used and broken and filled with holes from wounds. The Lord says here, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. So what the Lord is saying here is, yes, there's an external action here. You know about that. But I say to you, I want you to go deeper. Anyone who looks at a woman with lust in his heart has already committed adultery with her in his heart. In other words, the Lord is saying that you need your desire to be healed because it's broken. In a sense, because of grasping for the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil, that happens in different ways of saying, I want this, and God doesn't know what he's talking about because I know that this is going to be good for me in this moment. And maybe there might be a euphoria and stuff like that, but in doing that, do you see what happened to Adam and Eve? Their relationship, they started to blame each other. They started to say, well, that woman that you put in the garden with me wasn't my fault. She's the one who did it. Instead of before, they were walking hand in hand saying, at last, flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. Do you see the difference that happened when that brokenness started to come in their desire? And even the Lord would say, one of the wounds that's going to happen is you shall desire your husband and he will lord it over you. And this sense of this inequality and this brokenness that's there, that sort of becomes like a game of battling to say, how do I have power in the battle of the sexes? Do you see how there's so many things that are so connected here that maybe we're blind to? I really encourage you to ask the Lord in silence, Lord, where does my heart need to be healed? Because all of us are wounded. We're all products of this culture. We're all, in a sense, frogs in a pot that has all sorts of herbs and spices and things like that. And so we're flavored by the culture and we don't even realize it. If you just think of what we're experiencing in advertisements, in movies, in all these different things, even in our clothing, we're a sexualized culture. There's even, there was, even like car commercials, or like toothpaste commercials, or just sort of weird things, and everything is through that lens. And by doing that, we're just reducing the person to just an object to play with in our use. versus a mysterious child of God to love, reverence, and really sacrifice for. So, all of us, and all of us who are watching as well, the Lord wants to speak to your heart. The Lord wants to show you the areas in which, right now, your heart has been captured by the spirit of this age. And Jesus Christ, through the little still whisper, wants to come and show you that light that brings to a deeper fulfillment of life, love, and the happiness that you're looking for, especially within your relationships and within your marriage.